The wind did not howl, it was worse. It was a physical thing, a sheet of ice that did not bend but sliced, earning its grim reputation as the wind that cut like glass. Lieutenant Klaus Richter hunched low inside his borrowed oversized parka, the reversible white side facing out, making him a ghost in the swirling grey-white void. Beside him, Private Outlaw shuffled, his breath frosting instantly on the woolen cap pulled low over his ears. They were operating far above the tree line in the Caucasus, 9 men in a Gebirgsjäger patrol. Their task was scouting a supply route near a pass the Soviets used for infiltration. The snow was deep, often waist-deep off the packed trail, forcing the men to rely on their skis or the trail-breaking detachment ahead. Richter kept his eyes peeled for any sign of movement above the snow line, a ridge, a telephone line, anything to orient them. The visibility was barely 10 meters. He could smell nothing but the sterile mineral tang of the extreme cold. 10. The sound. It was not a gunshot, but a subtle, sickening crunch of a ski edge catching hard snow, much too close. Richter froze, raising a gloved hand. Before he could shout a warning, the air tore open. Tracer fire, unnervingly close, stitched the snowbank just ahead of Outlaw. The ambush was silent, unseen, and already inside their perimeter. Outlaw pitched forward, throwing his body behind the meager shelter of a frozen boulder, the impact jarring his oversized winter trigger mechanism. This ambush was perfect. Reconnaissance, pinning, cutting, and isolation. It was the essence of the Motti strategy, perfected by the Finns, now being used against the Germans in the high mountains. Richter realized they were completely encircled. His bolt mechanism, despite the cold-resistant oil, felt sluggish. He had only seconds before the enemy ski troops, camouflaged and silent, charged out of the blizzard. The flash of tracer fire in the Caucasus was not an isolated incident. It was the ultimate brutal consequence of a lesson the European powers had been forced to learn and relearn since the first shots of the war. Climate was not a nuisance. It was an active, decisive belligerent. For centuries, armies had relied on the concept of campaigning seasons, retreating to barracks when the autumn mud set in or the deep snow fell. Yet the scale and ambition of the Second World War negated these seasonal courtesies entirely. The conflict demanded that men fight not just in trenches but on cliffs, not just in summer dust, but in temperatures that could plunge metal to -40 degrees centigrade. The historical precedent was always there, a chilling warning etched in the ghosts of Napoleon's Grand Army, but the military imagination had failed to grasp the sheer, grinding reality of fighting the winter itself. Even before the invasion of Poland, Germany had recognized the necessity of specific training for vertical combat. Provisional training instructions issued in 1935 formalized the existence of a unique soldier, the Gebirgsjäger. By April 1938, this effort culminated in the formation of the 1st Mountain Division. These were not conventional infantry. They were men trained to operate where the ground was too hard to dig, where visibility was measured in meters, and where heavy equipment was useless. Their early specialized gear reflected this niche focus. They used the lightweight, wooden-wheeled Gebirgskanone, designed to break down into 8-pack saddle loads for mule transport. They also carried the tinted Schneebrill goggles, intended to combat the blinding glare of snowblindness. This represented a sophisticated, if limited, understanding of a unique terrain, but the true measure of winter's capability arrived in 1939, not on the German-Polish border, but in the desolate forests of Finland. When the Soviet Union launched its invasion, the Winter War demonstrated the devastating vulnerability of a conventional army. The Red Army was tied to roads and linear movement when confronted by an enemy that owned the snow. The conflict became a masterclass in asymmetric winter warfare. The Finnish strategy, the Motti meaning log bundle, was terrifyingly effective. It relied on reconnaissance, swift movement on skis, cutting the enemy's supply lines, isolating whole divisions, and then annihilating them piece by piece. Sergeant Pekka Niemi, a cross-country ski champion, embodied this new reality. He boasted of their ability to glide through the forests, to cut them up from the flanks like firewood. The Finns would hold fire until close range to maximize the shock of the attack. The aftermath along the Kemi River was a harrowing testament to the strategy's success. Shattered trucks, blood-stained seats, and roads jammed with dead soldiers and horses littered the landscape. Some of the animals had been eaten down to the bone by desperate owners. The Soviet Union paid perhaps 300,000 casualties for a Pyrrhic victory, leaving them shocked and humiliated. But they learned the lesson immediately. By March 1941, Moscow had codified its painful lessons into the regulations for combat in winter. These documents detailed everything from the bear walk movement technique to anti-tank defenses utilizing snow and ice. They emphasized the crucial role of ski patrols and detailed the preparation of column routes for military movements in deep snow. Critically, they began deploying Siberian infantry, astonishingly well-clothed for the coming trials, across the North Sea. The Allies were learning the same painful lessons. Winston Churchill's advocacy for supporting Finland spurred the hasty formation of specialized units like the 5th Special Reserve Battalion Scots Guards, nicknamed the Snowballers. Their training was rushed, and their equipment improvised. The historian of the Scots Guards considered it fortunate that these men were not flung away in an altruistic and ill-prepared sideshow. When the Germans invaded Norway in April 1940, the ensuing Allied counter-invasion became a miniature disaster. This failure highlighted critical deficiencies in training and gear. British soldiers wearing the early, cumbersome cold climate dress looked like paralyzed bears, scarcely able to move. Their clothing, like the coat, sheepskin, was never intended for combat. The French forces, though including the proficient chasseurs alpines, also suffered from damaged equipment and German air superiority. The inherent difficulties of operating in Arctic environments were profoundly underestimated by everyone except the locals. Excavating a cubic meter of frozen ground required over 3 hours, and a fire just to thaw the earth. The stage was now set for a global winter war. The Soviets were preparing, having painfully absorbed the Motti lessons. Germany, fueled by early summer victories and the strategic miscalculation that the war in the East would be over before the first snows, was dangerously unprepared. That failure of foresight, that lack of systematic preparation, would soon define the entire Eastern Front. The campaign transformed into a year-round endeavor where the ability to simply survive the cold became the fundamental prerequisite for victory. The frozen forests of Finland, in the winter of 1939 and 1940, offered a chilling preview of the warfare to come. It was a theater of operations where the laws of conventional combat were repealed by the relentless cold and the ingenuity of a desperate defense. The Soviet 44th Rifle Division, a massive formation of over 17,000 men, was strung out along the Rate Road. This road was a thin, white umbilical cord stretching through impenetrable terrain. Their goal was to relieve the beleaguered 163rd Division near Suomussalmi. They moved slowly, tied inexorably to the road. Their vehicles rumbled under the weight of supplies, their movement predictable, and their flanks totally exposed. In the shadows of the pine trees, where the temperature rarely rose above -20 degrees, the Finns watched. They were ghosts in white camouflage, moving with impossible speed on skis. Major General Haglund's men did not fight in lines, they fought in small, swift packs, utilizing the strategy they called Motti, the log bundle. The first step was reconnaissance, silent and deadly. Sergeant Pekka Niemi, a man whose legs were forged by years of cross-country racing, led his patrol through the deep snow. They moved not toward the enemy's front, but toward their joints, the weakest points in the long column where the supply wagons met the artillery. Niemi felt the familiar shh of his skis on the hard-packed crust, a sound that in the deep cold seemed to travel nowhere but straight down into the snow. They were close enough to hear the low, throaty rumble of the Soviet engines and the shouted commands of the officers. The second step was the cut. Niemi raised his hand, the wool of his gauntlet mittens stiff against the sub-zero air. He pointed his light automatic toward a section of the column separated by a few hundred meters of empty road. His men, young, physically fit soldiers trained for this exact environment, glided into position. They held their fire, resisting the urge to shoot the first target they saw. The doctrine was clear: maximum demoralization, maximum shock. When Niemi finally dropped his hand, the forest erupted in a cacophony of small arms fire. It was not a sustained barrage, but a concentrated, brutal burst aimed at the front and rear of the target section. Trucks shuddered to a halt, their engines killed, their drivers slumped over the frozen steering wheels. The Soviet soldiers, bundled in heavy, dark greatcoats, reacted with confusion, scrambling off the road and immediately sinking into the waist-deep snow. Their mobility was instantly negated. The Finns did not wait. They had cut them up from the flanks like firewood. The log bundle was now isolated. Niemi's patrol melted back into the trees, leaving the newly encircled Russians pinned and alone. The Soviets, unable to maneuver heavy equipment off the road and paralyzed by the cold, found the ground too hard to dig for proper cover. They were trapped in a logistical nightmare. Their field kitchens were too cumbersome to reach them, and the taste of frozen rations became their only sustenance. Over the next 2 weeks, the motte became a death sentence. The Finns encircled the cut-off sections, harassing them constantly, launching small, sharp attacks to prevent any organized escape. The psychological toll was immediate. Uncertainty, fear, and depression settled over the Soviet troops, exacerbated by an officer corps still reeling from the purges. Finnish signaller Viljo Kontio, watching the disintegrating enemy lines, witnessed the grim desperation firsthand. Soviet soldiers attempting to break out to the rear were coldly shot by their own side, a final, chilling testament to the panic that had set in. The Soviet 44th Division did not surrender. It was annihilated. The aftermath was a scene of industrial devastation along the Rate Road, a harrowing picture that would define the vulnerability of conventional armies for the rest of the war. Dead soldiers lay scattered amidst the wreckage of shattered trucks. The road was jammed with corpses, frozen horses, and abandoned equipment. Desperate hunger had driven men to strip the meat from the horses, leaving only bones picked clean. The Winter War was a Pyrrhic victory for Moscow, but it served as a catastrophic, unforgettable training exercise. The Red Army learned that winter warfare required not just endurance, but a systematic tactical doctrine focused on mobility, concealment, and logistical resilience. This lesson had yet to sink in across the English Channel. 4 months after the Winter War ended, the British and French launched their reactive counter-invasion of Norway in April of 1940, a campaign that quickly devolved into a miniature disaster. The operation was spurred by Prime Minister Churchill's altruistic desire to support Finland, but the preparation was hasty, bordering on the farcical. The men of the 5th Special Reserve Battalion Scots Guards, the Snowballers, were assembled with bewildering speed. This unit included soldiers of fortune, veterans of the Spanish Civil War, and undergraduates from India and Hong Kong. Their equipment was a testament to improvisation. They lacked suitable radios and Bren guns, and some new recruits had never even fired a service rifle. When the 1st Battalion Scots Guards sailed for Norway, they discovered a dire lack of mechanical transport, relying on simple bicycles to move through terrain that demanded tracked vehicles. General Caton de Wyatt, observing the British efforts, noted the sheer impracticality of the early winter issue clothing. If a soldier wore all the items, the cumbersome coat sheepskin and coat kapok lined, neither of which was intended for combat, they looked like paralyzed bears and could scarcely move. The coats were heavy, featuring metal clips that, while intended to be easier to handle with cold-gloved hands, only added to the bulk. The men of the 1st Battalion King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry experienced the campaign as a swift, almost surreal deployment. They unloaded at Andelsnes in the early hours of April 24th, facing immediate German air superiority and realizing the futility of their position. By May the 1st, they were back aboard ship, sailing home the next day. The men were utterly exhausted, and demoralization had set in, not just from fatigue and rearguard actions, but from the realization that every position was invariably disclosed by the continuous menace from the air. The inherent difficulties of the Arctic environment were profoundly underestimated. The British troops found themselves in a grueling green nightmare, where biting ants swarmed their foxholes in the brief periods of thaw, only to be replaced by the paralyzing cold. They learned quickly that mines were useless in snow over 25 centimeters deep, unless laid on baseboards. The Norway campaign, though a military failure, served as a harsh developmental spur. It forced the British to confront their deficiencies, leading to the 1941 publication of the manual Handbook of Clothing and Equipment Required in Cold Climates. The French, despite their proficient chasseurs alpines, also saw their equipment damaged by bad weather and relentless German bombing. In stark contrast, the Norwegian Army infantry uniform, drawing from local outdoor life, was warm, comfortable, and practical. Their rucksack was superior to the packs worn by most other armies. The lesson hammered home in the Finnish forests and cemented in the Norwegian fjords was that climate demanded specialized soldiers and specialized doctrine. The Soviets, humbled but rapidly adapting, were already codifying their new reality. The Germans, still basking in the glow of their blitzkrieg victories, believed they had time. They did not. The stage was set for the ultimate test of preparedness, which would unfold on a scale vastly larger than Finland, transforming the Russian landscape into the ultimate, unforgiving proving ground. The catastrophic failure of foresight was palpable not in the first snows of 1941, but in the lingering warmth of the preceding summer. Fueled by early, dizzying victories and a strategic arrogance that dismissed the historical precedent of Napoleon, Hitler and the Army High Command were utterly convinced the Soviet campaign would be a matter of weeks, finished long before the Schlammperiode, the mud season, let alone the deep freeze. This overconfidence translated directly into a catastrophic logistical gamble. The German war machine was equipped for a swift, mobile summer campaign, not a winter of attrition. By mid-October, the initial disaster arrived not as ice, but as mud. This Schlammperiode transformed the simple dirt roads into canals of bottomless sludge, swallowing wheeled transport whole. Vehicles slowed to a miserable snail's pace, inflicting great wear on the engines. The ordeal typically lasted until the ground finally froze solid in December. This continuous destructive use of tracked vehicles to assist the wheeled transport wore out equipment at an unsustainable rate. Then came the cold. The German advance stalled just 9 miles from Moscow in the winter of 1941, not due to a single decisive battle line, but because the cold itself became the enemy's most effective division. Lieutenant Gottlob Biedermann watched the thermometer plunge past minus 40 degrees centigrade. Sometimes the temperature would alternate with short periods of thaw, only making the subsequent refreeze more brutal. The promised winter clothing, collected through massive donation drives back in the fatherland, had not arrived. The bulk of the garments would not reach the front until January 1942, long after the cold had inflicted its lethal damage. Biedermann's company was paralyzed. The ground was too hard to dig, offering no shelter from the wicked wind that swept in. This wind was capable of whisking snow 50 or 100 feet into the air, obscuring buildings and making travel a near impossibility. The men were no longer fighting the enemy, they were fighting the physics of the environment. The weapons seized up first. The recoil liquid in the machine guns hardened, specialized cleaning oils had failed to arrive, and the standard lubricants for the rifles turned instantly to wax. Soldiers found themselves unable to even aim their rifle fire, their bolt mechanisms jamming and their firing pins shattering. The narrow tracks of the German tanks struggled uselessly through the deep snow, offering no effective mobility. Non-commissioned officer Helmut Pabst, writing letters home, painted a stark picture of dire conditions and makeshift clothing. His men resorted to desperate, ingenious improvisation just to survive. They bound their inadequate leather ammunition boots with rags. They padded their greatcoats, already insufficient for the extreme cold, with scavenged newspapers. Some wore coats 2 sizes too large to accommodate layers of stolen jumpers and padding, tying the coat skirts tightly around their legs in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. The sheer, mundane struggle was constant. The soldiers' feet would break through a fine, icy snow crust, requiring immense difficulty to extricate for the next step. A rhythm of movement that exhausted them rapidly. They were forced to watch each other's noses, ready to act when the tip turned white. They knew that frostbite, if untreated, could lead to severe punishment, and if contracted, often meant amputation. The most harrowing accounts spoke to the extremity of their logistical collapse. Edmund Bonhoff witnessed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Men, driven past the point of desperation, were sawing off the legs of frozen corpses to obtain boots. This was the only way to acquire footwear large enough to accommodate the necessary layers of rags and straw. The inability to dry wet boots because fires were forbidden when resting added to the daily struggle, leading to the pervasive threat of trench foot. Even the food was an ordeal. Soup had to be bolted before it froze solid in the mess tin. One infantryman recalled watching an axe rebounding as from a stone off the frozen horse meat. Butter had to be cut with a saw. The frozen carcasses of dead horses half hidden in the snow formed a macabre, tragic trail, their bloody red gashes indicating where hungry soldiers had cut out coveted chunks of meat with their knives and bayonets. This paralyzing halt, just 9 miles from Moscow, shattered the illusion of a swift victory. It forced the Wehrmacht into a defensive posture it was utterly unprepared to sustain, highlighting the stark contrast between their ill-equipped forces and the Soviet Siberian infantry, who were astonishingly well-clothed for the conditions. The Soviets, meanwhile, were executing a tactical shift born from the humiliation of the Winter War. Their March 1941 regulations for combat in winter was now being fully implemented, emphasizing combined arms, mobility, and the exploitation of darkness. While the German troops were immobile, paralyzed by cold, the Red Army was moving. The Soviets employed specialized ski units, equipped with light automatics and snow camouflage suits, expected to operate for several days away from friendly units. Their snow clearance methods were brutally effective, as seen with the columns of the Second Shock Army advancing through terrain the Germans deemed utterly impassable. The Soviet command had learned that the ability to simply carry out a march in winter was the basis for the successful outcome of a battle. The psychological impact of seeing the once mighty German advance stall and retreat was immense. Restoring Soviet morale during the fighting around Moscow, the Red Army was leveraging its growing superiority in enduring and exploiting the conditions. While General Winter was a significant factor, the true dictator of the outcome was the human element, the German strategic miscalculation and logistical failure that left hundreds of thousands of men to fight a war without proper clothes or functioning weapons. The Soviets pressed their advantage, adopting and refining their winter warfare doctrine. They understood that mobility on the battlefield and the ability to deceive and outwit the enemy could give even a numerically weaker force a feeling of superiority. They isolated the enemy by cutting communications, a strategy perfected by the Finnish forces. The Germans, now desperate, began a painful process of adaptation, attempting to copy their adversaries. By April 1942, they finally approved a two-piece winter uniform, and 1 million camouflage suits were produced. The provisional guidelines for the training and combat of ski troops was published in August 1942, superseding the less complete document from the disastrous first winter. But the damage was already done. The critical turning point had passed. The German soldier, reduced to stuffing rags and newspapers into his boots and greatcoat, had been forced to rely on sheer, desperate ingenuity to survive the climate. Meanwhile, the Red Army, having absorbed the hard lessons of the Motti, began a series of successful winter offensives, demonstrating that the war in the East would be waged, and ultimately won, year-round, in every condition the brutal landscape could offer. The German army's paralysis before Moscow was not merely a defeat, it was a forced, brutal curriculum. The realization that the war would extend into multiple winters shattered the illusion of a swift victory and necessitated a complete overhaul of doctrine and equipment. By 1942, the desperate, improvised measures of the first winter, the stuffing of trousers with newspapers, the soaring of boots from frozen corpses, were being codified into systematic, if still insufficient, preparation. The Taschenbuch für den Winterkrieg became the new Bible. It detailed not just equipment, but the necessity of constant movement during severe cold, the strict 5 to 10 minute limit on halts, and the use of snow caves and tents for longer stops. Adaptation became a brutal art form, demanding innovation from every soldier on the Eastern Front. They learned to elevate layering to a desperate science, understanding that several thin layers offered far superior defense than one thick coat. Rags, paper, and straw were no longer symbols of desperation but essential insulation, particularly for the vulnerable extremities and the kidneys. The wool-field cap was worn over a knitted toque, and the heavy steel helmet, in the worst conditions, went over both. Footwear had to be large enough to allow toe movement even when stuffed with 2 pairs of socks and straw linings. Junior leadership was tasked with the nearly impossible job of supervising the constant cleaning and drying of boots, a slow and critical process lest the leather freeze stiff and shatter. This desperate scramble for survival led directly to the elevation of specialized units. The Gebirgsjäger, already trained for vertical combat, were now honed into instruments of all-condition warfare. They were deployed across the most unforgiving theaters, the Caucasus, the Balkans, and the Arctic lines of Finland. Their existence proved that modern warfare had irrevocably transformed into a year-round endeavor, negating the traditional campaigning season entirely. These mountain soldiers were tasked with moving and fighting where motorized transport was completely impossible. They relied entirely on sheer, disciplined physical endurance. For long marches over deep snow, the trail-breaking detachment was vital. This detail consisted of 6 to 10 young, fit men rotating frequently, identifying the safest path, avoiding sharp turns, and improving the track for the following column with spades and marking equipment. To maintain speed, a leading detail would labor for only a few minutes before peeling off to the rear. This maintained a slow but rhythmic pace designed to save breath and avoid straggling. The heaviest loads, ammunition, mortars, and critical supplies were distributed onto the akcha, a small wooden sled. This sled was often controlled by a second skier from the rear, guiding it carefully over difficult terrain. The psychological resilience demanded by this environment was immense. Memoirs spoke of trench dogs, like the small, wolf-like mongrel assigned to Lieutenant Armin Scheidebauer's unit, whose sole purpose was to alert men to alien elements in the trench before human senses could detect them. Getting lost was a constant, terrifying danger. Men were taught to maintain calm, sniff the air for the distant scent of stables or newly cut timber, and mentally retrace their steps. It was this hard-won, often crude, expertise that now dictated survival in the high mountains of the Caucasus. Now we return to that blizzard-swept ridge where Lieutenant Klaus Richter and Private Outlaw were trapped. The soft, sickening crunch of an enemy ski edge had given away the ambush, followed by the immediate surgical burst of tracer fire. The enemy, likely Soviet ski troops, had executed the perfect Motti counter-tactic: reconnaissance, pinning, and isolation, using the deep snow and zero visibility to their advantage. Richter's small patrol was completely encircled, waiting for the final silent charge. The wind, which had been merely a physical burden, now became a cloak of death. Richter could feel the cold-resistant oil in his rifle working, but the bolt mechanism was still heavy, demanding excessive force to cycle. He did not issue a general fire order. The German principle, learned in the hell of 1941, was fewer weapons and more ammunition, firing only on orders and aiming single rounds with the greatest care. "Akya," Richter yelled, his voice muffled by the wind and his wool cap. Two of his men, Private Steiner and Corporal Vogel, reacted instantly. They had been trained specifically for this emergency measure. Their machine gun, a machine gun 34, was already lashed to a small akcha sled, its bipod equipped with improvised snow plates to prevent sinking. The gunner Vogel threw himself down into the sled, bracing his feet against the snow. Steiner, the hauler, grasped the harness. Richter knew they could not break out by fire alone. They needed mobility and shock. He signaled 3 men to secure their skis and move right, utilizing the deep snow as cover, moving with the soundless creeping taught in their manuals. He ordered Steiner to advance the sled in brief, violent bounds. Now, Steiner hauled the akcha forward. Vogel, lying prone in the sled, absorbed the shock, firing a short, controlled burst from the machine gun 34. The muzzle blast displaced and blackened the snow in a cone directly in front of them. The impact was instantaneous. The sound, magnified by the cold air and the sudden violence, ripped through the silent encirclement. Vogel emptied the short belt, throwing himself into the snow, as Steiner simultaneously threw the sled into cover behind a ridge of hard-packed drift. The Soviet response was ragged. A few bursts of automatic fire were aimed at the black cone of displaced snow, but they were shooting at a position that had already vanished. Richter's counter-tactic was working. The specialized training was overriding the paralysis of the ambush. His men on the right, moving on skis, were now behind the enemy's flank, gliding at a swift 4 miles per hour. They did not engage with sustained fire. Instead, they focused on isolating the enemy's command structure, firing aimed, single rounds at any figure that appeared to be giving orders. The ambush began to unravel. The Soviet troops, expecting a static, trapped target, were suddenly facing flanking fire from unseen skiers and a mobile sled-mounted machine gun that kept vanishing and reappearing. The German Gebirgsjäger patrol, though numerically smaller, was utilizing its specialized advantage, the ability to execute swift, soundless movement and coordinated fire in conditions that immobilized conventional infantry. Richter, scraping a thin layer of frost from the lens of his snow goggles, saw the enemy skiers begin to fall back, their formation breaking into disorganized clumps. They had been cut, but not destroyed. The patrol had survived the perfect Motti trap, not through sheer luck, but because the disastrous lessons of 1941 had forced the creation of soldiers adapted to conquer the impossible terrain. They had learned, at unimaginable cost, that in this new theatre of war, mobility and specialized training could give even a numerically weaker force the feeling of superiority. The war on the Eastern Front had peaked, transforming into a relentless year-round battle where the human element, equipped and trained for the frozen wasteland, determined the ultimate rhythm of combat. The catastrophic winter of 1941 and 1942 on the Eastern Front, followed by the grinding multi-year campaigns in the Caucasus and the Arctic, cemented a brutal truth. The environment was not merely a backdrop to the war, but a primary combatant. The immense human cost, the hundreds of thousands lost to frostbite disease, and the logistical collapse of armies paralyzed by cold forced a profound re-evaluation of military planning that would endure long after the final shot was fired. The German soldier, who had once marched confidently toward Moscow in summer boots, became the unwilling pioneer of specialized cold-weather doctrine. The improvisation of stuffing paper into boots and greatcoats, once a desperate measure to stave off freezing, evolved into detailed, systematic instructions on layering, insulation, and the critical importance of keeping the body's core warm. The papier-oueste, a simple aperture cut in newspaper and tied around the chest, and the use of rags and straw for foot insulation were grim artifacts of a logistical failure that ultimately birthed effective survival techniques. The very act of marching became a calculated risk, with columns instructed to keep moving during severe cold. They knew that standing around, especially in windy conditions, was a death sentence. Guards were assigned not just to sentry duty, but to wake each man individually at set periods to prevent freezing in their makeshift snow caves. The Soviet Union, having paid its own terrible price in the Winter War, emerged as the master of this new reality. Their regulations for combat in winter codified the lessons of the Motti and the necessity of mobility. They realized that the true winner of the winter campaigns was not the army that simply endured the cold, but the army that learned fastest and adapted most profoundly to exploit it. Their use of Siberian troops, their specialized ski brigades, and their systematic approach to snow clearance and column routes demonstrated a commitment to year-round warfare. This continuous process of learning and adaptation fundamentally changed military doctrine across the globe. The Norway campaign, for all its failures, acted as a harsh wake-up call for the British command. It led directly to the formation of specialized mountain warfare centers, like the Commando Mountain and Snow Warfare Training Camp established at Braemar in December 1942. Divisions like the 52nd Lowland Scottish Division were completely retrained for these bitter conditions. The Americans, too, recognized the unique challenges shared by mountain and jungle terrain, noting that both environments precluded the use of heavy equipment. They deployed specialized units like the US-Canadian 1st Special Service Force in Italy, followed by the 10th Light Division, which was an Alpine unit. The legacy of the Frozen Front was the birth of the modern specialized soldier. The German Gebirgsjäger and the Red Army Ski Trooper became the prototypes for future elite forces. They proved that technological superiority was useless when mobility was negated by 3 feet of snow. Their specialized equipment became standard features of military preparedness in high-altitude and cold-weather theaters. This included the Akja sleds, the reversible camouflage suits, the oversized winter triggers for rifles, and the use of dogs for reconnaissance. The ultimate lesson was one of strategic humility. The German advance stalled, not because of a genius Soviet general, but because of a catastrophic failure to respect the climate. That failure cost millions in materiel and lives. The final truth of the Eastern Front was that while the biting December wind and the -50-degree cold were formidable adversaries, they were conquerable. The victory belonged to the army that achieved logistical resilience, prioritized mobility, and mastered the art of survival. The war against the elements forced innovation and preparedness onto every major power, ensuring that future conflicts would never again underestimate the profound and often lethal impact. The blood-stained snows of the Ostfront guaranteed that the study of winter warfare would forever remain a critical, non-negotiable component of military science. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.